Okay, so continuing on with our Syntax of Love commentary series, going to pick up where I left off last time, which was the end of the section on the four functions, or you can call them the four positions. And now we are going to move on to each aspect in order: emotion, logic, physics, and finally volition. And for each of these aspects, it's going to start off with a general description. Uh, and he kind of adds this maybe half baked notion of why this aspect of human experience evolved and why it's adaptive for people. But it's interesting. And again, you just have to take what he says with a grain of salt and kind of read between the lines, try to look through his analogies, don't think of them too literally, and try to see like the abstraction behind it, because I think there is something valuable there that other people have been building on. Um, and another thing I would say about these coming sections, I started reading ahead. I've read through this text once before, and I'm reading ahead before I do these recordings. And one of the things I noticed about not so much the emotions section, but getting into the logic section, he just says some things which I think are outright just incorrect about his own system. And I think it's where he gets a little bit of tunnel vision and he starts kind of riffing on one, facet of whatever function he's talking about, and he takes it too far and he says some things which I think are just completely the reverse of the truth. So yeah, I guess I'm just saying, take this section lightly, and I would even say that each section of main part of this book, honestly, like kind of get it deteriorates in quality. Um, Not necessarily the quality of writing, and it's not valueless, but each section kind of gets worse in terms of how much you can literally take from it. Um, Probably the worst section out of this whole book is actually the type descriptions, because a lot of them are just these like character descriptions of the nicknames that he chose for each of the types. Like, okay, so and so is called Napoleon, this type is called Dumas, etc. And he just gets into like very weird territory. A lot of the descriptions are just negative, and some of them are just glowingly positive. So he's not at all egalitarian with it, and I think that's probably the worst section. And then the last section, which is actually about the syntax of love, intertype relations, it's okay, but there's definitely a lot that has been improved on since he kind of came up with this framing of typology. So that was a long intro, but I just wanted to prepare you for increasing amounts of bullshit, and it's interesting bullshit. And there's definitely nuggets of gold in here, but yeah, some parts get a little shaky. So anyway, moving on. The palette of sensations. So this is about emotion. Now, the word palette of sensations, I think that might be a mistranslation from Google. I think really it's supposed to be like, the palette of feelings, essentially. That being said, there is a lot in emotion that has to do with aesthetics, and art and acting as well. So art, music, acting. Um, so there is kind of a sensual quality with emotion, meaning like an aesthetic quality. But I think, yeah, the correct translation should have been palette of feelings. So anyway, emotion is a strange, vague, unsteady department of human existence. Everything about him is mysterious, and at first, what is most surprising is how nature could create such psychotypes in which emotion would be at the top. After all, the upper functions are the main weapon of a person. But can emotions serve as weapons? What feelings can be identified with a club? At best, an emotional nature can scare away an animal in the forest, a robber in the city, or pity the executioner with tears. But this seems to be the end of the matter. And in fact, I've just done a bit of commentary here. Um, it's it's funny. When he was describing the emotional, the emotions as like a weapon or as like a useful tool. Um, I think predominantly he's talking about the first emotion, one-e, and then when he said, at best an emotional nature can scare away an animal in the forest. I thought of this movie. Um, it's an animated movie. It's called The Princess and the Goblin, um, and I think it's based on a book by Hans Christian Andersen, but I haven't read the book. Uh, and there's just this like, I don't know, probably if you saw the movie as a kid, like the scene you'll remember is like the music, and there's like this song, and the song is like the protagonist, this young boy, and he's going through the woods, and he's like giving this kind of, he's belting out this like very optimistic, kind of emotional, high spirited song, and he's scaring away these little creepy crawly goblin creatures, goblin pets in the forest. Um, and I just thought that that movie, but that song in particular, like it's like a great demonstration of like one-e, but really like one-e with two with a second will. It's like a pure, unadulterated, distilled example of that. So yeah, like yeah, emotions can be not only like a kind of weapon or an offensive tool, but I think it can also not just in like a negative sense or like the senses he was going on before in the previous sections, like kind of emotion as like this like whiny crying thing, like a woman, whining to her husband. But emotions can be this actually more like noble and heroic um, kind of weapon or tool. So another digression right off the bat, but hopefully that helps. If you look at that movie, Princess and the Goblin, the song is called Spark Inside Us. So look that up. Okay, frankly, I was tormented for a long time by the thought of the role of emotions in the life and psyche of a person. After all, nature does not create anything in vain. Until I came across an article about marital relations in animals, and the facts presented in it made it possible to quite plausibly reconstruct the origin and meanings of feelings. The fact is that, in fact, emotion is a powerful weapon, but not a universal weapon, but adapted to one narrow sphere, the sphere of love confrontation. Apparently, the emotional function, first of all, is a love function, and the one whose emotion is high has a greater chance of becoming the winner in a love rivalry. Here is the power behind him. The origin of emotion is this. At first, it branched off from physics, or more precisely, from its sexual department. The need for such budding was that an animal's sexual activity, unlike humans, is episodic. Therefore, quite early on, they developed a need for special warning signs about their short-term readiness to mate. One of these signs was a love cry, the forerunner of modern emotions. Croaking, singing like a nightingale, squealing like a cat, the animal, according to the ethologist, begins to demonstrate its condition. Demonstrations leave indifferent individuals with an activated reproductive system, but in activated individuals, they, like a key in a lock, unlock response instinctive programs. Individuals of the same genders are encouraged to demonstrate the same behavior. Of course, as relationships in animal communities became more complex, the emotional palette became more complex and enriched, gradually growing into a whole system of signs. And the appearance of man in general produced a whole revolution in the field of application of emotions. Firstly, making it practically inexhaustible, but more importantly, by its transition to year-round sexual life, abolishing the sexual dominance of emotions. However, to this day, as an echo of the sexual sphere, feelings continue to bear the reflection of their origin. And it's not even about writing poetry and performing serenades, which usually precede physical intimacy. The point is that regardless of the specifics of a love relationship, which does not necessarily involve sexual arousal, we continue to judge them solely by the strength of the experiences we experience and observe. Therefore, returning to the problem of the origin and role of emotion, it should be noted that, as in the time of the first frogs, emotion continues to be the strongest weapon in the love struggle, and ultimately in the struggle for procreation. and therefore nature, despite its apparent lack of viability, continues to widely and abundantly produce individuals with high-ranking emotion. Okay. All of humanity, depending on the position of emotion at the levels of the functional hierarchy, is divided into romantics, first emotion, actors, second emotion, crackers, third emotion, and onlookers, fourth emotion. Why exactly these and not other names were given to representatives of different levels of emotional function, I hope the reader will understand from the further story. Okay, so now we're moving on to the first emotion section, which is called romantic. As already mentioned, one of the main features of the first function is its redundancy. The first function is no exception. The first emotion is no exception here. The envious statement of the artist Bryullov comes to mind that when Pushkin laughs, he sees his guts. So I think what that's saying is that he laughs so hard, his guts come out. I believe, or maybe it's he laughs in such a way that you can see his true nature. I'm not sure. Of course, excessive feelings can be expressed not only by exaggerated laughter, but also by streams of tears. The main thing in the behavior of romance is an inadequate, clearly excessive emotional reaction to current events. So I think here inadequate means not merely adequate, but clearly excessive emotional reaction. It's more than adequate. It's not just adequate. If the redundancy of the first emotion is multiplied by the specific love role of the emotional function, which was mentioned above, then I think it will become clear to everyone that a romantic is the best, simply amazing lover. By lover, I mean not so much physiological potential as much as the ability to excite a special state of euphoria, which humanity is accustomed to identifying with love. Flood of feelings, spiritual storm, volcanic passion. The romantic is endowed with this is endowed with all this from birth. Therefore, no matter how things are with him in all their functions, the romantic, one might say, is doomed to success and loved by nature itself. Good for them. Moreover, the attractiveness of a romantic as a love partner is not always determined by purposeful conscious or unconscious actions on his part. Serenades, poems, passionate whispers, etc. According to my observations, just a loud, contagious laugh or just a profuse eruption of tears, even not addressed to you personally, can awaken the love instinct, including the corresponding physiological parts of the body. In other words, the excess of the first emotion can not only infect a person with its mood, but also become a starter of sexual arousal. The famous singer Luciano Pavarotti answered the question, "Does the voice have sexuality?" Answered like this: "As for the sexuality of the voice, you would need to ask women about this. In general, I receive letters." Now, it looks like it meant them. I like how that ends. Just sort of like, in general, I do receive letters from them, implying that he receives like love letters from them. But judging by this comma here, this might have been another cutoff section, and he was going to go into I receive letters, blah, 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 but I kind of like how it ends there. In this context, the story of the novel between teacher Belikov and Varya Kovalenko from Chekhov's story The Man in a Case becomes especially clear. Varya was an obvious romantic. Broken, noisy, she keeps singing little Russian romances and laughing. As soon as she bursts into loud laughter, ha ha ha. With this laugh, it seems, Varya struck down teacher Belikov, or if we retell the content of their novel in the language of the biologist quoted above, Belikov, by the age of 40, had reached the state of an activated individual, and Varya's ha 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 became the key that opened the lock of his instinctive love program. The love of the attraction of the romantic at the same time is fraught with a certain danger for those who happen to fall on the hook of the violent eruption of his feelings. The fact is that humanity is still in the deepest misconception regarding the rules for reading emotional language. It is generally accepted that feelings are precisely that area of human existence where there are no lies, and that the expression of feelings is always an impeccably accurate reflection of a person's internal states and the system of relationships between people. In reality, this is not so. The form of expression of internal states depends on the position of emotion on the steps of the functional ladder, and relationships in general proceed not according to the emotional, but according to the volitional function, which we discuss in detail below. So that's interesting, because you might think, relationships are something mostly determined by emotions. That's usually in other typologies. You say, well, feelings, and it's also about our relationships, and you would think it like determines them. Or, perhaps you might think, well, relationships are neutral to these aspects, and instead relationships are just determined by intertype relations. Okay, meaning different types have different relations to other types. But what he's saying is that it's actually determined by the volition function, the will, and that kind of brings again his kind of more, cynical kind of naturalistic view that people are status conscious. People react to power, and you can just kind of see that throughout his work. He has this, I don't want to say cynical, but just kind of grounded and I guess unromantic view, weirdly enough, of humanity, where it's like, no, it's actually willpower that determines relationships in general. Okay. So I say this because there's a terrible danger of taking the love outpourings of the first emotion at face value, and under their influence, taking steps that the romantic does not expect from you. Let's say if you see sparkling eyes and hear a hot whisper, I love, I adore, etc., then it does not follow from this that what is said should be taken literally, and you should rush to notify your relatives about the imminent wedding. A romantic always expresses his feelings with great exaggeration. So if he says, I love you, I adore you, then it only follows that he likes you in some way. In any case, when listening to the love outpourings of a romantic, it is advisable to drop 20 to 30% of the emotional intensity in order to get a fairly accurate and clear picture of the experience. And in fact, I've actually had this experience recently. At my workplace. There's an individual who I've met before online, but he recently came down to the site itself, and he I like the guy, but he's very overly kind of like optimistic, and like he's like, oh man, Lord Trekker, he's like, you're the greatest, like you're a genius, like, oh, we love you here. And he's just very but he does that to everybody, and maybe sometimes he's negative, I don't know, but from what I've seen, it's like he just has this like heightened, like very glowing view of everyone. And so you kind of have to you have to turn down the knob a little bit and be like, okay, well, you're happy with what I did, but you don't really, you're not really like in love with me. You know what I mean? So yeah, that's definitely a type of person I've noticed. Liza Minnelli gave a charming description of the specific inadequacy of her first emotion in an interview. To the question, aren't her experiences artificial? She answered, no, of course, but they are thickly powdered and painted. If I fall in love, I say on the very first evening, I can't live without you. Don't disappear from my life. I can't live without you. You are lying? It's all too mixed up. Yes and no. In the morning, if he leaves, I can forget about him and not remember the whole day. But on the other hand, it really seems to me that if he left forever, I would die. And so she means in the moment, if he left forever, she would die. The seething of romantic passions is not only inappropriate to the situation, but also completely unrelated to the subject of feelings. The passion of the first emotion is selfish. It is born and lives in romance quite autonomously, from itself and for itself, regardless of the formal provocateur of experiences. Therefore, Elena Vinograd, Pasternak's muse, during the creation of the collection My Sister's Life, was absolutely right when she asserted that she herself is not in the book and none of her features are there, only Pasternak himself and the poetic generosity of his romantic inspiration. I confirm the truth of what Vinograd said with my own discouraging experience. Having once found myself an unwitting provocateur of romantic inspiration, I was extremely disappointed to discover that in the poems supposedly referring to me, I'm simply completely absent. The shocking truth is that a romantic is a current, I don't know how to pronounce this, capercaillie, living in an illusory world of exaggerated experience, a voluntary hostage of his excess and autonomous emotions. Okay. So basically, if you didn't pick up on that, what he's saying there is that, in a 1E type, they'll write a poem about somebody, but really they're not writing about that person. They're almost writing about a projection of that person in their own mind. And you'll see that's pretty different from how 2E comes across in the way he describes it. And this is just due to the self-absorbed nature of the first function. So, continuing on. In Chekhov's previously mentioned story, The Man in the Case, one can find a curious and not without poison observation of the Romantics. So, a curious observation, but not without poison. I noticed that Ukrainian women, and Varya Kovalenko was from Ukraine, only cry or laugh of average mood they don't have. Okay, so they're kind of like binary with their mood. It's exaggerated. Although now it is difficult to say where Chekhov's statistics on the emotionality of Ukrainian women came from, in principle this observation in itself is absolutely correct. The Romantic is indeed very characterized by a high contrast in the coloring of his experiences, and he achieves fullness of expression only when the needle on his emotional speedometer begins to go off scale. Moreover, the transition from one extreme to the other occurs almost instantly. Pushkin's brother-in-law wrote, Pushkin's transitions from a fit of mirth to fits of overwhelming sadness occurred suddenly, as if without intervals, which was caused, according to his sister, by a highly nervous irritability. He could be irritated by both Homeric laughter and bitter tears when whatever you want, according to your imagination. It is best to compare a romantic with an actor in the ancient theater, in which there were only two contrasting genres, tragedy and comedy. Therefore, if the owner of the first emotion decides to choose a career as an actor, then preference should be given to theater rather than cinema, since the very specificity of theatrical performance requires a certain acceleration of sound. But this is by the way. The main thing is that for a romantic, joy is not joy, but mania. Sadness is not sadness, but depression. The happiness of those around us is that most of these experiences remain inside and only echoes of states reach them. This happens because the first emotion is not inclined to share feelings, prefers to savor them alone, being an actor and a spectator in one person. Okay, so again, the self-absorbed and kind of others negative aspects of this type. So when the power of the romantic experience reaches its peak, a release of emotions often occurs. And here anything can await him, from world fame to a madhouse. The fact is that forms of manifestation of the peak of the first emotion are diverse. They can take an artistic form, poetry, painting, music, dance, which is often followed by fame, recognition, etc. Or they may not take shape at all, or rather take shape in the form of a stream of tears, incoherent cries, and articulate screams, followed by sometimes imprisonment in a house of sorrow follows. Let's be completely honest. Both music lovers applauding in boxes and stern orderlies from psychiatric hospitals often encounter the same phenomena for the first emotion. The difference is that the music lovers call it genius, and orderlies call it manic depressive psychosis. Although the line between one and the other is not just transparent, it is absent. It all depends on the point of view. Poetry lovers considered Pasternak a genius, literary officials considered him crazy, and both sides had enough arguments in favor of the correctness of their diagnosis. The harsh truth of life is that manic depressive psychosis in modern psychiatry is an emotional reaction that is inadequate to events, i.e., something that is inherent in the first emotion by nature itself. I will not say that all romantics are endangered of being imprisoned in a house of sorrow, but the fact that from childhood they have problems associated with the emotional, which seem to be the best and strongest side of their nature, is undeniable. Tearfulness is the earliest sign of the first emotion. However, the normal reaction for a romantic child with tears to crises and external pressure is rarely correctly understood by others and gives rise to contemptuous characteristics, such as, these are a little strange, crybaby wax, roaring cow, etc. And since nothing changes in the order of functions of the romantics over the years, constant bullying on this matter can impose on them something like a complex of emotional super-inferiority. One woman with such a complex wrote to a psychiatrist, "I cry over books and in movies. I cry at the sound of an orchestra, listening to songs. It's enough to see a girl in a wreath on TV. The slightest trouble and again tears. I've already begun to hate myself for them. They have become ingrained in my voice. I feel like I'm somehow defective." Think the author of the letter can be consoled by the fact that she is not alone in her suffering, and even great people often cannot cope with their tearfulness. For example, Maxim Gorky never had a day without tears, and when reading poetry, even very bad ones, he cried without fail. And so that little bit about Maxim Gorky is interesting to me because, in this, if I don't know anything about Maxim Gorky, I know very little about him, I should say. I think he was like a Soviet, socialist realist artist. But it's like in here, he's described as like very emotional, right? But yet in socionics, the logical, sensory introvert type is nicknamed Maxim Gorky, and that type is supposed to be like an emotional robot, And it's like, I mean, I don't know. Maybe I'm confusing Maxim Gorky's. I don't think so. But yeah, just something that stuck out to me. Circumstances that contribute to increasing the distance between reality and the emotional reaction to it will be discussed below. Now it is important to note that the diagnosis, manic depressive psychosis, as well as its everyday analogs, crybaby, hysterical, nurse, clique, roarer, should be withdrawn from use, because the absence of an equal sign between a fact and an emotional reaction to it can be incriminated by the vast majority of humanity, which nature itself predetermined to the owner of an excess in first emotion. Which nature itself predetermined to be the owner of an excess first emotion. Okay. Suspicion of the incapacity of the romantic arises among those around him in connection with his ineradicable craving for mysticism. The range of mystical moods of the first emotion is enormous, but no matter which of the mystical directions the romantic adheres to, the main thing for him remains the unreliability of the arguments of reason and the unconditional faith in the reliability of experiences. More precisely, the situation here is somewhat more complicated. For the first emotion, one bare postulate about the superiority of feeling over reason, as in early Neoplatonism, is not enough. It is much more important to have a consistent artistic structure that is sufficiently convincing in its imagery. But whether this structure pretends to have any intellectual design or does without it at all is not important. Let's take, for example, astrology, the seeker or open adherent of which is almost always a romantic. Although attempts have been made and are being made to formulate astrology scientifically, it clearly does not need it and does not rely on it in any way. And it's clear why. This is not where her strength lies. The power of astrology lies in its own artistic structure, where the names of the Latin gods assigned to the planets of the solar system, combined with the mysterious images of the signs of the zodiac, build a gigantic stage of an inexhaustible and vibrant cosmic theater. The trails of meaning behind each of the Roman gods and each of their combinations, multiplied by the trails of the meanings and interpretations of the zodiac signs, create a kaleidoscope that can be rotated indefinitely without the risk of repetition and without fear of spectator boredom. And I really like that paragraph. That's a very illustrative view, and I feel the exact same way about astrology at this point. Not that, I'm far from an expert on it, but yeah, before I really understood astrology, I just considered it like, sheer bullshit, whatever. And then I started looking into it a little bit more, mostly through Vic DeCara's concept of it. But yeah, my takeaway was kind of like, yeah, this is like kind of like a stage. It's like a stage play. Your chart is like yeah, it's like a little scene almost, and it's like, okay, you have this god here, and he's like, oh, this is the king god, this is the king planet, and he's here, and he's doing this thing, and then you know, Colonel Mustard's in the coat room with the candlestick, right? It's like this little scene is created, um, and yeah, it's kind of fun to think about in this like a stage play, right? Like something emotional. Something people oriented. So that and I can see I can see the draw to that. Um, Therefore, we can firmly say that astrology is indestructible. Neither forceful methods, which some Roman emperors resorted to, nor rational arguments will help in the fight against it. You can kill astrology only by de-articizing it. Being artistically undressed, she will die instantly. But astrologers are not suicidal, and therefore one will have to put up with astrology and mysticism in general, just as one has to put up with the weather. So I guess we're stuck with it. As long as it's cool and mystical and artistic and pleasing to emotion, we're stuck with astrology forever. So there you go. Faith is a specific emotional mystical form of what rationalists call knowledge, and it will live on Earth as long as emotionalists are alive. In conclusion, briefly, without being distracted by the particulars, we know a typical difficulty for the first emotion. It is by nature mystical, and is the main creator and consumer of all religions, magic, superstitions, as well as any other artistic sign and sign systems that claim to be absolute, which does not always find understanding on the part of those around him, with a different order of functions, and creates the impression of romance as a figure, at best absurd, at worst insane. Okay, so other people with different functions will see him as kind of absurd, and at worst insane. All right. Take a sip. All right. About the handwriting of the Romantic. It is enough to look at the handwriting of Pushkin and Pasternak to imagine the general contours of the handwriting of the first emotion. Of course, the art of calligraphy is now in decline, and you will not find handwriting similar to Pasternak's, not to mention Pushkin's. However, the unity of the principles of writing is preserved. Firstly, the sweeping, lengthy handwriting. There is a lot of air between the elements of the letter and the ends of the letters, directed up and down, are excessively elongated. This is probably why Akhmatova called Pasternak's handwriting flying. Secondly, the handwriting of the first emotion is characterized by decorativeness, extra dashes, tails, curls, in a word, elements that are not necessary for conveying information, but give the letter non-informative aesthetic significance. Emotional excess is clearly visible in the punctuation of Romance. He loves strong, sharply expressive characters, such as dashes and exclamation marks, and also often abuses the spelling of words with a capital letter. Someone well noted that Gorky, I think it's supposed to be like Gorky made dashes like lightning. Indeed, Gorky's punctuation is the clearest example of a romantic style of writing. So Maxim Gorky, not LSI, he's actually a 1E type. Romantic poet. A poet even when he does not write poetry or does not write at all. The uniqueness of the style of the first emotion lies in the conscious or unconscious poetization of expression, which consists in the use of various kinds of tropes or techniques that can enrich, or perhaps better yet, give increased brightness and imagery to the image. Take the favorite romance metaphor. Take the favorite romantics metaphor. Wait, maybe I'm not reading that correctly. All right, I'll just read it as it literally is. Take the favorite romance metaphor. Metaphor as a device is used not only by the first emotion, which will be shown below, but it is typical of romance to use it in two forms, gilding and a magnifying glass. Metaphor by its very nature presupposes the inadequacy of comparison, which suits the first emotion, which is inadequate in reaction. Again, I think it means not merely adequate, but kind of above and beyond in reaction. So redundant in reaction maybe is a better way of putting it. But the peculiarity of the romantic metaphor is this, that it works to exalt the object being compared, or in any case, to greatly increase the scale. So, once criticizing one poem, Maximilian Voloshin exclaimed, "Beer can be compared to the sea, but not the sea to beer." For all its claim to absoluteness, this phrase is only partly true, but as a particularity, it impeccably accurately reflects the Romantic's uplifting and hyperbolic understanding of the task of metaphor. The above also applies to those cases in which the Romantic uses a metaphor to wound the subject. For example, when Pushkin, seething with anger, wrote in an epigram that the quiet professor Kachanovsky thins his ink with the saliva of a mad dog. Not only was there nothing adequate to the original, but the subject itself was terribly exaggerated, albeit with a negative sign. Continuing the theme of formal preferences of the first emotion, I will add that the Romantic in poetry, creating and consuming, in addition to the brightness of the image, values brevity most of all. So, in other words, 1E prefers brevity in poetry. Bloch, for example, considered the optimal length of a poem to be 3 to 4 quatrains. However, in asserting this, he did not deduce some general laws of the poetic craft, but his own, conditioned by the first emotion, understanding of the nature and meaning of poetry. It lies in the fact that the first emotion, being effective, strives for a result in poetry, i.e., to describe the peak of emotional states, neglecting what preceded them and what followed. So, because it's results oriented, it's just looking for the juice of the matter. It's looking for the core, the essence of the emotion. It wants to capture it. It doesn't care about processing the emotion and questioning it, and showing what, like he said, what came before it, what preceded it, what followed. It's just the emotional result is what matters. Boris Pasternak's words that poetry is picking out the raisins of melodiousness from the life of a sweet cod can be considered programmatic for the first emotion, because the poetic task of a romanticist lies in such picking out, with everything else being taken out of the brackets. Therefore, I think that the ideal poetic form for the first emotion should be considered Japanese haiku and tanka. In them, the romantic principle of instant photography of unique emotional states, the principle of picking out raisins of melodiousness, is presented in the most concentrated form. Okay, that's pretty illustrative. I'm afraid one might get the impression that the owner of the first emotion is certainly a poet, and marks every emotion with rhyming. But that's not true. Indeed, during the period of the highest experiences of Pushkin, in his own words, his hand reached for the pen for the paper, etc. But let's say for such a romantic as Khrushchev, at the same moments the hand could reach for the shoe for the table. So Khrushchev, he was like the Russian, what would it be, like premier? I forget the formal title, but the head of the Soviet Union, and he was like banging his shoe on the table. Okay, that was like a famous historical event, I guess you'd say. Manifestations of the first emotion are diverse. It is impossible to list or retell them. Therefore, when faced with first emotion in life, with emotion, it's better, just in case, not to expect poetry from her. Okay. Activities that are far from the artistic sphere, and a complete lack of culture in general, do not prevent the romanticist from considering himself the highest and indisputable artistic judge. The latent feeling that culture, being a direct derivative of emotions, is his native environment, allows the first emotion to absolutize his own tastes and imposes them on others without hesitation. Sometimes it seems justified, sometimes it doesn't. Let's say when Alexander Bloch, when asked by Stanislavski about his impressions of the latest performances of the Moscow Art Theater, answered bluntly, "It was very bad." You can still somehow understand. But when Khrushchev began to stomp his feet on artists and poets, it seems to go unnoticed. However, both of these tactlessness are phenomena of the same order, the result of an innate ... translation cuts off. Unfortunate. But I think we probably get the idea. To the purely external manifestations of the first emotion, one should add unusually lively, bright, excessive facial expressions in relation to the events taking place, along with an exaggerated Italian gestures. Actually, the language of facial expressions and gestures is the same language as all others, and naturally, when expressing the feelings of a romantic, it is just as inadequate and exaggerated. And again, remember his use of inadequate here. I will say more. I had to meet people with a quiet, unforced vocal system, and it was grimaces coupled with bright gestures that betrayed their first emotion, disproportionately to the described situation with widely spread arms, frequent grabbing of the head, etc. So first emotion types are animated, which would make sense. The only anthropological feature of the first, okay, so this is again kind of where he does get into a little bit of a physiognomy, which I'm fine with personally, but some people might be bothered by. And I'm fine with it in theory, although the way he uses it, I think is probably just complete bullshit. But the only anthropological feature of the first emotion, quite clearly traced in the Caucasoid Negroid branch of humanity, is large bulging eyes equipped with a kind of radiant eternal illumination. So I believe what he's saying is that in, white and black people, but not like Asians, bulging eyes is a sign of 1E. Or it's an example of the way 1E can manifest. So, okay. Nature has generally arranged it in such a way that at the moment of strong emotions, regardless of the position of emotion on the levels of the functional hierarchy, a person's eyes begin to glow. Thus, Anna Karenina, Anna, I think it's Anna Karenina. I'm not sure. I haven't read that book. In love with Vronsky, herself felt her eyes glowing in the darkness. This glow is especially characteristic of the romantic, from whose eyes sometimes sheaths of bright sparks fly out like fireworks. And let us give it its due. This circumstance greatly colors the first emotion, sometimes bringing us, sinners, to sexual arousal, even in cases where the external appearance of the romantic does not excite us in any way. Let us remember that in War and Peace, it was the radiant look of the ugly Princess Maria that won the heart of the hussar Nikolai Rostov. For my part, I can assume that the shine of the eyes in connection with emotional and sexual arousal has something to do with the dilation of the pupils. Probably a strong internal injection of hormones of a certain emotional range causes the effect of pupil dilation, similar to the effect of instilling belladonna extract into the eyes. It is not without reason that the word belladonna is translated as beauty. It is not without reason that during psychological experiments, the sight of a woman with dilated pupils inspired men with the idea that they were sexually aroused. In general, it would be interesting to trace this phenomenon of brilliant dilated pupils as an exponent and stimulator of sexuality back to the animal world, and it would be interesting to study the hormonal mechanism of eye glue itself. But this is no longer a matter of psychology. There is a special discipline for this. And again, the way the paragraph ends with a comma makes me think that there's more to the story, but unfortunately it cuts off there. So I will pause here and I'll continue with 2E after I get back.